So the upload schedule got a little wonky this week because I did the Asian Seasonal Tournament English cast. If you want to check that out, it is on this channel. But I also wanted to give you guys a quick rundown of my thoughts of the new set because I do think it was a lot more impactful than the Monuments of Power. And because I'm casting the upcoming Gems Christmas tournament this weekend, I need to get a little bit more acquainted with the meta and try to think about what I'm going to be seeing this weekend. This isn't going to be a replacement for the Tournament Tactician, but I do want to go over the set in terms of how I think they're going to impact the tournament meta. So we're going to do like a really quick rundown style of things. First of all, Boomship and Wiggly Burblefish, I think these are going to have absolutely no impact. There would be room for Boomship, but because the Premier Bilgewater deck, I believe, is still go hard, even though it does have keg generation, you don't want to be playing things that dilute the Zap Spray Fin pool, and Wiggly Bubblefish just doesn't seem like anything. It's just kind of a worse coral creatures, which we don't love. Now, the Grand Plaza, I think, might actually just be one of the best cards in the set. In fact, what I have been running personally is a Mono Targon Eclipse style deck with 3 copies of the Grand Plaza, and it's actually been working out pretty well. It does still have its weaknesses. I've always been more of an anti-aggro player than an aggro player. That's kind of what I jump on day one in ladder, so keep that in mind when I get to the Zoe cards. And then Captain Arika, I don't think this is going to see play anytime soon, but the Grand Plaza is actually, I believe, going to shape the tournament landscape in a major way. There's just so much that this card does, and it's one of the landmarks that getting down 2 copies of doesn't feel bad at all. And I was even running copies of Divergent Paths in my Targon deck because I, 1, didn't mind seeing multiple copies of Grand Plaza, and 2, would love to be able to kill my opponent's Grand Plazas if it came down to a matchup like that, or even Targon's Peak. There's a lot of landmark experimentation going in on ladder, but actually in tournament, I would expect Grand Plaza and Targon's Peak to be the 2 sort of mainstay ones. As much as I like Scargrounds, I don't know if it's really ready for tournament yet. I think it's going to take a little bit more experimentation, but definitely expect Grand Plaza to pop up a lot because it is in the Riot format this weekend. There's a good chance that players are even bringing multiple Grand Plaza decks. I know Scouts has been popping up, Lucian Callista's at the forefront of everybody's minds, and of course my own Targon deck that I do think, the Daybreak units, just being able to give them Challenger and really take full force of the temporary stats that they get when you play them, I think is just absolutely phenomenal. Scargrounds, as I had mentioned, I think is going to take a little bit more experimentation before we can really see what it's going to do to the meta. I know that there's a lot of cool combos that are available with it, but I don't think any of them are really going to help you into... so think about what we saw last patch, right? It was a lot of Go Hard, it was a lot of Shen Fiora, Draven Ezreal, Feel the Rush, things like that. These are not decks that I feel like Scargrounds is helping shore up some matchups against. It that Stairs is a little bit of a different story. I have seen some Targon Peak decks. That's sort of one of the new instances of Field of Rush, and they do play It That Stairs, partially so that they have another Avalanche, they can get down a large free unit, but also because they want to be able to obliterate their own landmark at any given time. So if Targon's Peak comes in, then I would imagine It That Stairs is going to be pretty prominent, but outside of that, I don't think that you're main decking this for landmark removal. It is possible that Field of Mina goes for it instead of Icequake, but honestly, I think being able to get Icequake down as early as turn 4 thanks to spell mana is a little bit more important than getting the body. So honestly, I'm not super optimistic about It That Stairs unless Targon's Peak comes up, but honestly, I don't think that's a deck that we're going to see winning or topping tournaments on the opening weekend. Monastery of Hirana and Homecoming, they're pretty bad, but like a lot of other things in this set, see, Monuments of Power was very straightforward. I could tell you from day one what was and what wasn't going to be a thing. We all knew that Tom Soraka was going to be a thing. Even Riot knew that Tom Soraka was going to be a thing because it was one of their lab precons. As far as the newer stuff, there's a lot of more complex interactions here, and there are a lot of things that are going to take a lot longer to figure out than just on opening weekend. And as I've told you guys time and time again, I'm not really that much of a deck builder. I have very linear thought process when it comes to that, and I don't really see minutiae and things like that, which is very much what Monastery of Hirana exists in, is this minute meta space that I cannot comprehend. Maybe there turns out being a broken deck with it later on, but I feel like that would be more of a flash in the pan thing than a mainstay. Ionia is pretty open in terms of tournament lineups, but honestly, I'm not feeling optimistic for this one. But that said, Go Hard does still seem to be the dominant deck of the format. Nopify is good against that, but because you're going into a tournament setting, maybe if you're going for a triple Ionia lineup, this gets to replace one of the decks, but honestly, I thought Lee Sin, Shen Fiora, and then just maybe Feel the Mina was a pretty solid enough triple Ionia lineup that you don't really need to try and get creative with some kind of Monastery deck. I'm not even sure what you would necessarily run this in. It would probably be Yasuo, and we have seen players like Eric's go for Yasuo Leona over Lee Sin in recent memory and have a fair amount of success with it, but I don't think Monastery of Harana is really the kind of deck that they're looking for, and then Homecoming doesn't really matter. You would rather play Will of Ionia. It doesn't matter that it hits landmarks because you're playing Targon, you're playing Solari Priestess. You can go ahead and just invoke some kind of removal for a landmark. It's not that big a deal. Overall, I think the Ionia card's probably going to be not the least impactful, but right up there with Bilgewater in terms of they're not seeing any day one play. And I'm not really optimistic about their long-term play either. Now, I'm not a big fan of Zoe, especially with Go Hard being the meta, but I mean, obviously, if you are playing in a tournament, you are going to be banning Go Hard if Zoe is something in your lineup, or you're trying to pick on a different deck. That said, it looks like Zoe, just by nature of the kind of deck that you want to be playing, doesn't do super well against any of the previous meta decks that we saw. I'm talking Draven Ezreal, Feel the Rush, Go Hard, Shen Fiora. It doesn't really impress me in any of those regards. And the cards outside of Zoe, a lot of these cards aren't that splashable. I know there's been a lot of talk about Moonlight Affliction, but there doesn't seem to be anything right off the top of my head that you even care about running this in. I don't think that Mistwraiths really wants to go for a card like this. It's pretty expensive, but I could see it. Because I'm not super impressed with Atrocity either. It does suck that you can't really get this down the same turn as Harrowing, but say, you just replace Atrocity with Moonlight Affliction, you go ahead and take blockers off the table that could otherwise block your Fearsome units, and maybe that's enough. I think the problem is that because you do have to Nightfall it, it's a little bit too awkward. They don't really run a lot of burst spells to get burst speed Nightfall activators, so I'm not really seeing a deck where Moonlight Affliction naturally slots in the tournament meta. And I really don't think it's going to solve any of the problems of other... I don't think it's going to create a new archetype. I don't think that Nightfall is suddenly going to come back. I think that Withering Wail and Go Hard and other 1-damage pings are a little bit too prominent for something like that to happen, because Stygian Onlooker is a massive combo piece for actual, honest-to-God Nightfall decks. And even just a keg onto a Diana, being able to kill it, it's not looking great. I do really like Solari Sunforger, though. That might be able to push Daybreak back in a little bit. I don't think it was really a bad choice. I think that it got burned out a little harder than you expected it to against things like Draven Ezreal and Go Hard, and honestly, Solari Sunforger could help with that. It does put you back into a pretty healthy life total range, basically negating the face value of a Pack Your Bags in terms of damage. So, maybe Solari Sunforger rather, does put Eclipse a little bit back on the map, and then Targon's Peak, I'm scared of this one. I don't think it's going to do a whole lot day one. Maybe it's actually going to peak on day one. Haha, get it, Targon's Peak. But I don't think long-term Targon's Peak is a card that's going to stick around and have, a lasting impact on the meta. And if it does, I'm scared. I'm very scared. But, maybe it does take over the Feel the Rush style, and just being able to play 2 Feel the Rush decks is something that players have really sought in the past, and especially with Go Hard still being so prominent, maybe double Feel the Rush is the way to go. And Targon's Peak does make that a lot easier with Aurelion Soul. The problem you're going to run into is that Trundle overlap, but honestly, I don't think Braum is too bad of a sort of replacement for Trundle in a deck like this. It is still like a 10-10 challenger when it comes off Feel the Rush, and it's still a difficult card for Go Hard to deal with. Maybe it is what it is. Maybe you even put in Sejuani or something instead, just so that you still have the overwhelm. But I think Targon's Peak probably going to peak, I would say, week 2. I think week 1, people haven't refined it enough, don't feel confident. Maybe week 2, we all figure out Go Hard's still a major problem. We decide to go double Feel the Rush more often. And then from there, I would expect it to fall off. Obviously, a lot of people were really excited for Riven, and I want to start off by saying that I do not think a deck focused on Riven is going to do very well, but I am curious for Riven's place in a Draven Ezreal deck. You take out the Draven, you put in the Riven. She still gets an amount of value because she is getting those Reforge cards every time you get the attack token, but she's not as consistent as something like Draven. For example, if you have the attack token on 3 when you play her, I don't think that you get a Reforge card. I think it's only when you gain the attack token, so things can get a little bit awkward then, just not really generating as much value as you would want her to. She has a nice alternate win condition that your opponent has to think about more than you do. You just kind of throw down the Riven and let it ride, but I don't think the extra 1 toughness is really worth losing quick attack or even just getting those burst speed spells. I think that Draven is going to turn out to be the better card long term, and even in the short term, people don't seem to be super impressed with what Riven is providing. I think out of all the Noxus cards, the one that I actually am the most optimistic for is actually Survival Skills. I'm not totally sure where it's going to fit in just yet. It is a really niche card. It doesn't stop hard removal. It really only stops damage based. But I do think that Survival Skills is something that's going to pop up in some deck somewhere along the line relatively soon. Even if you're just using it to, say, negate a pack your bags or stop, yeah, specifically stop a pack your bags turn and then go into a strong open attack, if that is something that you're worried about your opponent having, then yeah, maybe survival skills does get to find some space, but I don't think we're going to see it in a day one deck. I don't think it really fits into Riven Ezreal that much. They don't really play a whole lot of units, and you're more susceptible to the hard removal of like Ruination and Vengeance and things like that. If Victor and Piltover and Zon become very prominent in the meta, then maybe survival skills gets to find its way in, but I'm not super optimistic for any of the Noxus stuff, at least week one. Now, Piltover and Zon and Victor I actually am a little excited for. I'm not so sure about Victor, but things like Ballistic Bot and Aftershock have brought back Championless Burn. And it's not quite Championless Burn, they are playing, I believe, Teemo and Draven. But a lot of players didn't really love the approach that Draven Ezreal took. They knew that it was a strong deck, but they didn't really love the playstyle. I could definitely see swapping over to Burn being a big contender for decks like that, especially because you want to outpace Go Hard and Feel the Rush, and now all of a sudden you have this great third option to try and do that. You could run a couple Grand Plaza decks in a Burn deck and try to just go toe-to-toe with FTR and pick on that kind of deck, or even the Go Hard. It doesn't necessarily deal with Burn decks particularly well. There's a little bit of life gain in the deck, but really not as much as you would want against a strictly Burn deck, especially with a spell like Aftershock coming out. That completely negates the 3 Go Hards that you throw down in terms of life gain, and they don't really deal with units particularly well. Things like Ballistic Bot are even going to be outside of the range of a Keg Withering Whale, and Boom Crew Rookie going to be able to, sort of fall into that same category. I think that there are enough powerful 1 and 2 drops in Piltover and Zon for this to be a realistic archetype. And Victor, maybe he's in there, maybe he's not. I don't really know. I haven't really seen a mid-range Victor deck that I like too much, but I do think that just Ballistic Bot and Aftershock is enough to actually push Burn to the forefront of everybody's mind. And I know that Hexcore Foundry is something that players have been experimenting with in new versions of Go Hard decks, and I'm not sure how much that one's going to pop up, but I know that we are still looking for sort of a third Go Hard deck. The second one is Spooky Karma, which also players weren't super in love with. The Ezreal version was sort of the third one, and people liked that even less. Hopefully, Victor and Foundry, maybe they found a way to make the Piltover and Zon version of Go Hard work a little bit more, but I'm really looking at Ballistic Bot here, especially on the opening weekends. So players don't want to screw around this weekend, right? They want to play something that they think is realistically going to win the tournament, and I could very well see Burn being a part of that. I don't think Victor so much, but Piltover and Zon champions historically have always taken the longest to figure out. If Heimerdinger were released today, you would not see a week 1 or week 2 Heimerdinger deck. It'd be week 3, week 4, well into the meta. Once everything is established and you build the counter lineups, that's when you start to see something like that. So I am optimistic for Victor in the coming weeks, just not so much week 1. And the Shadow Isle cards suck. And that is sort of my quick rundown on the set, how I think it's going to impact the tournament meta. It was probably a little bit more vague than you wanted, but I am sort of running around at the moment trying to figure everything out, get my bearings for the tournament this weekend, because as a caster, I have to memorize all these card names, watch a bunch of streams, know what decks to look out for, and all that. So kind of got my hands tied here. So Tournament Tactician will be tomorrow, where I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into this, try to have a little bit of a better grasp on the meta, because things are constantly changing on the day-to-day, but I do think that Go Hard, Feel the Rush, Shen Fiora, I'm not really seeing anything new that sort of knocks these out. I know that Go Hard is very prominent at the top of the ladder right now, so I would still expect an insane amount of Go Hard decks this weekend, but that's just kind of is what it is. I'll get back to you guys tomorrow with Tournament Tactician, talk about that a lot more in depth, and try to set you up for success going into this opening weekend. And thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.